George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. It's such a great honor to be with you today. Yeah.
This is going to be a lot of fun. Let's start with the beginning. Where were you raised, and how did you get to Atlanta?
I was born in Kingston, Pennsylvania, crossed the Susquehanna River from Wilkes-Barre, where my father is from. My mother is from Kingston. And for the first 8 years of our life, we were there in that coal mining town. In the 1930s, I think it was the #1 anthracite coal mine region in the United States. My grandfather, my mother's father, had quit school in the 4th grade to become a coal cracker. And he died in 1965, and a month later, my grandmother began receiving checks from the Black Lung Society, and nobody even knew he had black lung. So he was a child in the mines, essentially. But that town fell into depression in the 1950s. My father moved down to the Philadelphia area looking for work, found a job in the Trenton Potteries, making toilets and sinks and ashtrays out of porcelain, moved the family when I was 8 years old in 1955 to a new town in Pennsylvania, northern suburbs of Philadelphia called Levittown. And Bill Levitt came home. He was a master builder before the war of great houses out on Long Island. And when he came home after the war, he'd been in the Seabees building landing strips and hospitals and barracks in the South Pacific for the soldiers. He said the important thing now is to build houses for every soldier returning home because they're all going to want the American dream. And he built these communities with these little stick houses. He could build them 16 an hour, I think. He got such a production process going. And a veteran like my father coming home from World War II, my father was 18 months in the North Atlantic. He could buy one of those houses with his signature, $100 down and $100 a month. And so we grew up in Levittown. 17,000 homes built on about 22,000 acres, right near Langhorne, where the Langhorne Speedway was, where they were doing early dirt track racing, and A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti, those guys would come in and race. My father became a car salesman at Reedman's, the largest single automobile dealership in the world with 16 new car franchises. They're television commercials, Rick. You know what they were? It was a helicopter flying over like 80 acres of cars. And my father became like one of the top sales guys. He was a high school dropout. But he was brilliant in his own way. And so I grew up in Levittown, Pennsylvania. And when I graduated from high school, barely got out of there, I was a bit of a juvenile delinquent and had a lot of problems in my teen years. But when I got out of high school, I went to Temple University. Well, I got married first and flunked out of college, and then went back to Temple University, graduated from Temple in 1972.
I was recently in Philadelphia, and I was telling somebody I did a doubleheader at the Palestra one year where I saw Temple play Maryland at 11 o'clock, went to the Reading Market and ate like a pig, and then came back and saw the nightcap, which was St. Joe's versus Payne. Philly's a great town and a fascinating place, I guess, to have gone to college.
Our high school had a pretty good basketball team, and I graduated from high school in 1965, and I think that was the year we played in the Palestra in sort of I think it was regionals heading for the state championship. We got eliminated by a team that had a kid named Hubie Marshall on it who scored 52 points against us. But a couple of years later, I think 1968 in the Palestra, I saw maybe 69, Santana, Canned Heat. I don't know if it was Quicksilver Messenger Service, but then the Quaker City Rock Festival came in. I saw Janis Joplin live twice. A lot of great groups. Jimi Hendrix. Saw a lot of great groups in Philly as they toured the major North American cities in the rock circuit, you know.
Well, how did you get to Atlanta?
Well, I graduated from Temple in 1972. It took me that long. So I graduated from high school in 65. It took me 7 years to get through college with a degree in journalism. And my best friend was a photographer, and he and I were looking at a map of the United States, and we were both anti-war protesters, and we decided that the epicenter of social change was in Atlanta, the home of the Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, who had been assassinated in the Civil Rights Movement. And I moved down in October of 73 with my wife and, 5-year-old son, Jason. And we settled in. I got a job writing for an ad agency in Colony Square, which was at the time the big communications hub of all the ad agencies seemed to be there. And went through the 70s working in the ad business, winning some awards. And in 1980, about the time when Ted Turner launched CNN and Headline News, I became a freelance writer-producer and started doing films and ad campaigns and promotional materials for his networks, and then a lot of other companies in Atlanta. And through the 1980s, I was winning, creative awards for my work. And I had teamed up with a couple of great designers, one of whom was Brad Copeland. And I know where your next question is going to go, so go ahead and ask it.
Well, it's interesting. How did you and Brad get together and get involved with Billy Payne and the Olympic Games?
Well, that's the key story to my professional career. I was doing a lot of work with Brad. He was one of the top designers in Atlanta, and Turner had teamed us up, and we were pitching clients and winning a lot of business together. I was a freelance writer producer. I wasn't working for him or anything, but we were partners. And I was training for my 4th marathon at the time, and he was running with me. He could never make it past 10 miles on the road, but he started talking to me, I think sometime in the fall of 1988, about coming to meet a guy. He wanted to introduce me to a guy named Billy Payne, and Billy Payne was organizing an Olympic bid for the city of Atlanta. I was really busy with other writing projects, didn't have much time for it, but then Brad designed the winning logo. He entered a competition. He designed the winning logo, the famous 5 A's logo for Atlanta, and his passion for the Olympics just immediately doubled down. And he doubled down on it, and he started saying, you got to come down and meet this guy. They're looking for a writer to do the bid books. You're the perfect guy. I had just won some awards for a piece I had done on Atlanta and a piece I had done on Georgia for newcomer kits for a bank. They were like 60, 80-page brochures on the city and the state, separate ones. So I knew the history. I knew a bit of the history. Of course, I knew the civil rights history pretty well. In fact, the year I moved to Atlanta, 1973, Maynard Jackson was elected as the first black mayor of a major southern town, and Andy Young was sent to Congress the year before. So I was pretty avidly involved in that politics, the political scene, at least following it. And Jimmy Carter had run for president in the 70s, and so it was really, Atlanta had become a great cultural and political and business capital. And I went down to see Billy. Brad talked me into it, and we set up a meeting, and we went down to see Billy, and I pitched Billy and I got hired as the lead writer on the campaign, and Brad and I were teamed up as the creative team for the Olympic bid. And in April of 1989, we were dispatched to Lausanne, Switzerland. And we were sent by Billy and Ginger Watkins and Linda Stevenson, Charlie Battle, the lead team of the Atlanta bid, to study Olympic history and to find out how to construct a new set of bid books, which was the manual for how Atlanta as a bid city intended and planned to organize the Olympic Games.
Now, had you been an Olympic fan before this? Were you familiar?
Yeah, I was an Olympic fan. I was a big boxing fan, especially. And so as a kid, I can remember when Muhammad Ali fought Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was from Philadelphia. We thought no one could touch him. I remember sitting outside in my father's 1955 Plymouth, which was the only radio that we had that would get the signal from Lewistown, Maine, and listening to that boxing match of Ali. So I was a huge boxing fan, and I knew Ali had won a gold medal in the light heavyweight division in the Rome Olympics. Of course, I had followed the marathoning. My uncle was a great marathon. I was very interested in that. So when Abebe Bikila won in Rome, that was of interest. Followed him in Tokyo when he then won his second marathon in a row in Tokyo. The games in 1968 were in the crucible of my youth when I was doing anti-war protests, when Tommy Smith and John Carlos finished first and third in the 200 meters and raised the black glove fists in the civil rights protest. I mean, all of that's, and George Foreman won the boxing championship, took another approach and walked around the ring waving the American flag. All of that stuff was absolutely fascinating to me. I knew all about Johnny Weissmuller because I was a fan of Tarzan as a kid. I knew he had broken through as a great swimmer in the Olympics in 1924 in Paris. So I had a little bit of the history of the games, and of course it followed the tragedy of Munich. I can just remember watching Jim McKay on camera saying they're all gone, and the devastating effect of all of that. And I didn't understand that there was an Olympic movement behind the games, I just thought the games were the greatest sporting event in the world, that all the countries of the world came together to compete on a sort of an equal playing field. And so, yeah, and then I had great memories. I remember Rayford Johnson coming forward. I remember Bruce Jenner winning the decathlon in Montreal. Of course, then we boycotted the Moscow Olympics. That was a political nightmare for the 500 young people who had made the team.
I had a dear friend who was the #1 U.S. Modern pentathlon athlete, Bob Neiman, and he had trained his whole life. He was an Air Force Academy graduate and was supposed to win the gold, and of course didn't go.
Didn't go, yeah,
and
heartbreaker
Dave
for those
Gavitt,
people.
Dave Gavitt, the great Dave Gavitt, was coaching the Olympic basketball team that didn't get to go.
Yeah, yeah.
And so a lot of people missed out.
Yeah, and then of course, then the LA games came. And the LA games set such a new standard for the magic of the production. And a couple of our friends went out to LA for it. I had a friend from Philly who flew out to Seattle, rented a motorcycle, and rode his girlfriend all the way down the coast to the LA Olympics, and was calling me with reports, this and that. And then one of Brad's, the guy who was Brad's account services manager, went out there with his girlfriend and came back, and he was a triple jump guy from Auburn University, and he reported that it was just fantastic. Of course, we watched all of it on TV. I remember Mary Lou Retton, and of course the great Carl Lewis, and the men's gymnastics team, and what's his name, Edwin Moses, and all the great athletes. And so this was only, this had just happened. And here I was being hired to write an Olympic bid. So all these memories were very fresh in my mind. And I looked at the civil rights history of Atlanta. When we got to the museum, we got in April of 1989, Brad and I walk into the Olympic Library in Lausanne, Switzerland for the first time. 15 minutes after we walk in, I open up a set of old bid books, and I see a picture of this guy with this big old mustache, obviously 19th century style, big mustache, silver-haired, empathetic face, soft eyes, and it says, Baron Pierre de Coubertin founded the modern Olympic Games as part of a movement to unite the world in friendship and peace through sport. Well, here I am, an ex-anti-war protester, reading that there's a movement behind these games. Billy and Ginger and Charlie, they briefed us on the games a little bit, but they didn't tell us anything about this movement and all of that. And Billy used the term goodness. Billy Payne would use the term goodness, that the Olympics embodied the goodness of humanity. And he would always be talking about the values, but he didn't have anything specific about Coubertin and all this. And I said to Brad, oh my God, Brad, this isn't just an event, it's a movement. That was my exact quote. And I felt like peace had come calling for me, and I felt like I was in the right place at the right time, and this is where I belonged. And I decided, and Brad and we went to Tokyo, Japan that fall. We wrote the bid books. We delivered them to Lausanne with Billy. We were honored to, go to Europe to do that. Started studying Olympic history, started studying the life and times of Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And when Atlanta won, September 18th, 1990, Atlanta won the right to host the 96 Games, Tokyo, Japan. That day changed my life.
Well, it's interesting. That was probably the first games that literally used the ideals of the movement as a way to win the bid.
We totally aligned, and the film, we're going to talk about the film, of course, but Atlanta 1996 was the intersection of the civil rights movement and the Olympic movement. And when Bob Judson and I teamed up in 2019 and decided to do a film about the Atlanta Olympic Games, because nobody had ever done one, the bid, the games, and the legacy, a comprehensive film, we started with that point, that without the civil rights history of Atlanta never would have won the bid. And therefore, and then we celebrated that. And when you think about then Muhammad Ali stepping out iconically and writing it symbolized and kind of epitomized and embodied, was emblematic of everything the city had stood for. Putting it on stage in front of a global audience was just, a magical thing. So, yeah, we were in the library in Lausanne, Switzerland, April 1989, and April of 1989, and a year and a half later, we won the right to host the Games, Tokyo, Japan, and then the Olympic world opened the door for me and Brad, and that's pretty interesting. That's how we got to know each other.
Yeah, it's Atlanta, in some ways, because of some issues of the bomb, some political issues with vendors, got what I called a black eye in a lot
It
of
did.
ways, and
It did.
and yet the story has never been told until this film. And I've said this to you before, as a fifth generation Atlantan, I was born at Emory Hospital. Your film is a love story
Yeah.
of the city of Atlanta. Uh,
Deliberately.
it is, and I mean, and it's just a wonderful film. I'm so excited that people are going to be able to see it. They're going to be able to watch it on Delta Airlines. They're going to, see it in a variety of television settings. We're just so excited about it. But talk about the special relationship that you capture between Billy Payne and Andy Young.
The day after, so 2019, I had written a book about Baron Pierre de Coubertin. I wrote a 565-page fictionalized biography, and the film rights, although I ended up self-publishing and I ran out of time, couldn't find an agent. In time, I wanted to get it out in time for the Rio Olympic Games in 2016. That was after doing 10 Olympic bids around the world. So my sense of the Olympic ideals grew and began to crystallize more and more as I studied the life of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and I helped 10 cities, including Atlanta, articulate the values and ideals of the Olympic movement in their social and cultural context. And then this guy buys, Oscar-nominated film producer, buys the film rights to The Idealist, which is the name of my fictionalized biography. So I figured, I better brush up on filmmaking in case we sell this to somebody. We still haven't sold it to anybody, although NBC wanted to buy it at one point. We weren't convinced they were going to turn it into a film, so we didn't sign the deal, but that's still out there. I called this old filmmaking buddy of mine who had done a bunch of television documentaries, had built the greatest post-production studio in Atlanta, Crawford. His name's Bob Judson. I called him up and said, let's have a drink. So I go to have a drink with him. I take my novel and I show it to him, and he says, hey, I want in on this. This sounds like a great film. I want to be part of it. I said, well, you can't be. We already sold the rights. He said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, nobody's ever done a great documentary on Atlanta, on the Atlanta Olympics. And he had worked on filmmaking for the Atlanta Olympics. He and I had done a Final Four bid together, and we won it. We had done a Super Bowl bid together, and we won it. So we had a good background and a good working relationship from the past. And he said, I'm all in. He said, why don't you write something up on it? Next day, I started writing and realized this is the story of, as I said, the intersection of the civil rights movement and the Olympic movement. And the best way to tell this story, actually the only way to tell this story, is through the untold story of the friendship between Andy Young, a black man, and Billy Payne, a white man. And the first treatment was all about those two. And basically, if you look at the United States and the state of race relations today and look around the world, finding positive stories about race relations, about blacks and whites teaming up and doing great things together are kind of rare. And when you find one, I think you have a moral responsibility to tell it. So I went and called Billy and I called Andy, and they both agreed, and we ended up having a shoot. Our first shoot was January 7th, 2020. We got the two of them individually, and then we put them together and had them talk on camera. Their reminiscences are wonderful. They're all in this film. And essentially, we decided that was the most emblematic and symbolic way to tell the story that the world didn't hear, as you've rightfully pointed out, because of what Charlie Battle called the 4 T's. Atlanta was struck by 4 T's. There were some technology issues. There were transportation issues, so the media reported nasty things about the transportation system, and only lasted a couple of days. All cities have those problems. Then there was trash and trinkets on the street because the city betrayed, under Mayor Bill Campbell, sort of betrayed the Atlanta Olympic Committee and did their own sidewalk merchandising program, selling squares on the sidewalk to poor entrepreneurs for a couple $100 trying to make money on the games. And it just loaded the sidewalks up with what the newspapers would call trash and trinkets. And then the last T, the 4th T, was terrorism. And when the bomb went off in the park on the ninth night of the Olympic Games. And fortunately, Atlanta overcame all of it and produced a brilliant game, sold more tickets. We sold more tickets than any city in the past, and although London claims they might have broken the record, I don't think they have. We sold 8.5 million tickets. Most events were sold out. We sold more tickets to women's events. I think we sold 4.7 million tickets to women's events than Barcelona sold to all of its events. They sold 4.2 million tickets. And so we sold more tickets than LA and Barcelona combined. And it was really quite a marvelous atmosphere in the city for the competition and the brilliance of the athletes. I mean, I think 77 nations won medals. It was the largest hall by a group of nations. 197 nations came. This was the first games from, I think, from 1976 Montreal that there wasn't some form of boycott. So all the countries that were invited came.
Well,
And
it's also, like you mentioned, it was the coming out party for women's sports.
it was.
And I mean, and
It
it was
really was.
probably the first games that Title IX had directly impacted
Yeah.
the athletes, and we had so many wonderful stories of female athletes that overachieved and just so many gold medals that we won. And the other thing is I was fortunate to work at the time for Advantage International, which is now Octagon, and
I remember that, yeah.
we had 14 corporate clients in the Atlanta games. And one of the things I was really proud of is for our sponsor and client Haynes, we did a daily T-shirt auction,
Yes,
500
I remember.
days. You remember at Atlantic
Children's
Square?
Ticket Fund.
Exactly, and it was for the Children's Ticket Fund. And
That
so
Olympic
there's some
aid.
things in the games, the games in black and white. There's some things you talk about that were established, like talk a little bit about the Garth Brooks program and the program that y'all funded, for Olympic relief.
This was called Olympic Aid. There are a couple things we cover in the film. First of all, let me circle back to the women in Atlanta. Sarah Hirshland, who's the CEO, female CEO of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee right now, we did an interview with her for the film, and she said, yeah, Atlanta was a watershed moment for women. And she said, not only on the field, but off the field. These were the first games in which a third of the competitors were women. So the gender equality was on the rise, and it was moving up fast. And I think Atlanta had the greatest single leap in terms of the percentage of women in the history of the games. And Sarah says it's not only those roles on the field of play that were important to women in Atlanta, but during the bid process, Ginger Watkins and Linda Stevenson and Cindy Fowler were three members of the Atlanta Nine, as it was known, the families that had set their lives aside to bid for the games. And those three women had an enormous impact on the success of the campaign in the city. And then Ginger and Linda went on within the organizing committee to be. Ginger was executive vice president in charge of the games, and Linda ran all the cultural and volunteer programs. So that part of it, they opened doors for so many people. And Janet Evans, who we interviewed, says those games were absolutely fantastic. It was Janet's last games. She had helped with the bid. Billy became fascinated with her in Seoul and recruited her to the bid, and she'd help with the bid. And she said, because of the way I was treated by Billy, I never had any fears about my gender or my age or my ability to speak to people of authority. And look at her now. I mean, she's head of athlete relations. I think she's an EVP of athlete relations or community relations or whatever in Los Angeles, running the 2028 Olympic Games. That's another legacy of the Atlanta Olympics.
Well, another one is you interview Shirley Franklin. Shirley Franklin.
Yeah.
Shirley worked for Andy, and she
Maynard
goes
before
on to
that.
becoming the first female mayor of Atlanta. So, I mean, again, when you start talking about seeds of change,
God.
there were so many seeds of change in the Atlanta games, and you capture a lot of that
And
in
the
the
two
film.
programs, the one program you erroneously called the Garth Brooks program, but Garth Brooks had a significant role in it. And I'll get to that in a second. The two programs that we cover in this film, which are part of the untold story, the Billy and Andy partnership and friendship is the big untold story. And then, of course, the Equal Economic Opportunity Program. When we won, Maynard was mayor. Andy was mayor when we were bidding, but the year before he termed out. Maynard Jackson got elected, and Billy and Andy and Mayor and Maynard, as Shirley tells it, struck a deal that the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games would have, in fact, a program to ensure that minority and female-owned businesses across the city had opportunities to work on the Olympics. And in the end, somewhere between 30 and 40% of all contracts had a minority or female-owned business partner or lead in them. And so there was easily a quarter billion, maybe more spent. Maybe it was 500 million. I don't think anybody actually has the figure. There was a headline in the New York Times about this program that really benefited up to almost 4,000 minority and female-owned businesses across the country did business around the Olympics. And we tell the story of a couple of them whose careers and businesses just took off as a result. The second big program, Andy Young at heart is a minister, right? That's what he thinks about people. He thinks about what people need. And he's working on the largest, as Billy called it, the 1996 Centennial Olympic Games, the 100th anniversary of the modern Olympic movement, was going to be the largest peacetime event in the history of humanity. And it really was. And Andy thought, how can I extend the benefits of this to children in conflict zones around the world? How can I help the neediest of people through these games? Because that's Andy's mindset. That's what Andy does. Andy always thinks about, how can I use what I've got to help others? And so he's at the United Nations, where he had been ambassador, and he's giving a speech at the United Nations at the request of Juan Antonio Samaranch in favor of mounting an Olympic truce to sort of stop wars around the world during the run-up to the Atlanta Olympic Games. And in the audience is a guy from Lillehammer, speed skating, three-time triple speed skating champion, Johan Olaf Koss, who had started Olympic Aid in Norway, in Lillehammer, to help the people of Sarajevo, who had hosted the Games 10 years before and were in war-torn straits at that time. And you remember, during Lillehammer, Samaranch actually flew down to Sarajevo to deliver some aid to those
Exactly.
people. And this guy comes up and says to Andy, this is incredible. We've got this thing called Olympic Aid. We'd really love to. And Andy's talking about, how can we get the Olympics to help humanity, to mount a humanitarian effort. Andy jumps right in. They form Atlanta Olympic Aid 1996. They talk the USOC into granting them rights to raise funds. And who writes the first $1 million check to them to support this program? Garth Brooks. In the end, they end up raising about $13 million. They get truce and tranquility peace treaties established in 14 countries around the world before the Atlanta Games that are in conflict, either in war or conflict, and they end up immunizing and delivering sporting goods and helping the lives of 15 million children around the world in partnership with UNICEF. And it was an incredible program nobody's heard of. And so we celebrate that in our film. We celebrate, of course, Billy's brilliant vision for Centennial Olympic Park and how that came about. And then we go into, after we go through the games and showcase who won what and how that happened. This is not a film about the athletic competition. It's about two men, and it's also about the legacy that the games left for the city. And we've got Martin Luther King III talking about the intersection of the values of the civil rights movement and the Olympic movement.
Well, every episode of my podcast, it has a theme, and today's theme is about race relations. And this is such a positive story of what happens when people can set aside their differences and come together for a common purpose. And the city benefited, the world benefited, and your film captures the whole story so brilliantly. This is also a podcast about baby boomers, and before you leave, I want to talk about what's next, because you're not done. You've got a long bucket list of things that you want to do. Talk about some of the next projects that George Hirthler wants to do.
Well, I want to continue to write about the Olympic movement, its leadership. I'm working on a book right now about the Olympic movement with a significant focus on what Thomas Bach, the German fencer who became the first gold medalist elected president of the IOC, his transformative impact on the Olympic movement and the IOC in particular through his Agenda 2020 reforms over the last 12 years. He was elected in 2013. He's retiring in 2015. He just solidified his legacy of building gender equality in the Olympics by helping get elected his protege, Kirsty Coventry, who was head of the Athletes Commission of the IOC for, I think, 8 years. He got her elected president. He helped to get her elected president of the IOC going forward, so she'll serve an 8-year term with another option of being elected for another 4 years. There's a film that I'm starting to work on with Mark Parkman, who built the Olympic Channel and helped run OBS out of Madrid, Spain, the Olympic Broadcasting System, for 10 years. I don't want to disclose who it's about, but it's about an American Olympian who's had incredible impact across the last 50 years on the Olympic movement worldwide. And then, I've got my memoir in the background, how a baby boomer who was a juvenile delinquent, arrested 6 times between the ages of 14 and 18, ended up being a lead writer and creative force in the Olympic movement worldwide. It's and I've got a novel about the 1960s called The Jingle Jangle Morning I've been working on, and
I think you wrote a Western too.
I wrote a Christian book that had a little Western theme. I do have a short story called The Wichita Kid, which I'm almost finished with, which is a tribute to the shows we used to watch as children growing up. Wyatt Earp, Gunsmoke, Have Gun Will Travel, Wanted Dead or Alive, The Rebel.
Yeah, we recently had a whole show about cowboys that we're really proud of.
Cowboys were our heroes.
They were. Well, listen, you're one of my heroes. The film is The Games in Black and White. It's exceptional. You're exceptional, and I can't thank you enough for being a guest today on Shaboom.
Rick, this has been a real pleasure for me, and I've got such immense respect for what you've done in your career, and I'm glad that we found a few intersection points to work together over time, and thanks so much for supporting the Games in Black and White. I do hope it's a big hit, and I hope a lot of people get to see it on national television at some point.
It's going to be terrific. Well, thanks again, George, for being here.
Thank you, Rick.